Okay, so we're going to talk about the muscular system. Okay, so the muscular system includes the skeletal muscles and accessory structures, and we'll talk about what all of those things are. Some of the things that it does provides mobility, and mobility is being able to move through your environment, like walking, jumping, things like that. Provides movement, and that's not necessarily moving through your environment, but just moving like your arms and legs, being able to eat, feed yourself, that sort of thing. It provides heat, produces heat rather, and the way that it does that we'll get to a little bit later, but just to give you a little early preview, it is from primarily the chemical reactions that go on, but also a little bit from friction. So muscular system includes skeletal muscle only. So we do have, as you remember from previous chapters, cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, but for the purposes of talking about the muscular system, we don't include those. So we've got to discuss the structure of the actual muscle tissue. So every single muscle is made up of thousands of individual muscle cells that are also called fibers. So these fibers are made up of these myofibrils that are bound together with this layer called the endomysium. So you can see this layer called the sarcolemma here, and we'll get to what that is a little bit later, but the endomysium essentially surrounds that sarcolemma there. So the way it's arranged and organized is the muscle fibers are bundled together, and you can see right up here a muscle fiber, and you can see that it's bundled, and there's a bunch of muscle fibers right there. Well, that bunch of muscle fibers, which is what each one of these little sections are here, is called a fasciculus or fascicle. Plural for that would be fasciculi. So just like this was surrounded by the endomysium, as you can see in this picture right here, fascicles or fasciculi are bound in something called a perimysium. So if you remember, endo means within or inside, peri means around. So when we bundle the fascicles together, that's when we end up getting the actual, what we call a muscle. Okay, and they are surrounded by the epimysium. Epi means, as you remember, upon. And then we have a further tissue surrounding those, a connective tissue membrane called deep fascia, which is this white thing here, and we'll learn later that it is what becomes the tendon later on. Okay, so muscle cells are specialized for contraction, and muscle fibers can only do one thing. They can only shorten. And so that has some pretty strong implications that we'll talk about later. So let's talk about tendons. So tendons anchor muscle to bone, or they anchor muscle to something else. Essentially, they anchor muscle to muscle. They're usually round, but not always. But you can see that the picture here, the example I usually use is the bicep. As the muscle ends, the deep fascia continues on and is what becomes the tendon, and so they're generally going to be round. So they're made of dense fibrous connective tissue, as you remember from previous chapters, which is primarily made of collagen fibers. And as I said, it's a continuation of the deep fascia. And so you remember that the covering around the bone is called the periosteum, and these fibers actually merge with the periosteum, and some of them will even penetrate into the bone, and we call those Sharpie's fibers. Not going to be on the test, of course, since it's not in your notes, but that's why you can actually get a separation of bone when you have an injury. It's called an avulsion fracture, because those Sharpie's fibers penetrate the bone and they're so strong, rather than tearing the tendon, it can actually pull a chunk of the bone off. Okay, so back to the microscopic anatomy here. Okay, so the sarcolemma, which is this surrounding right here, this is what we call the cell membrane, okay, which you remember is also called the plasma membrane. So for whatever reason, we don't call it that in the cell of a muscle. You could, but they just call it the sarcolemma. And you remember sarc means flesh, which is what muscle is, and lemma means covering. The sarcoplasm is another name for the cytoplasm, okay, so the liquid portion of the cell. So inside the sarcoplasm, we have myofibrils, and that is these individual fibers here that make up the cell. So remember, we're looking at a cell right here that's been cut. They store glycogen and they store oxygen because the muscle needs glycogen for energy source and they need oxygen for normal metabolism.
Skeletal muscle consists of bundles of tiny myofibrils that run the length of the muscle. Myofibrils consist of even finer fibers called myofilaments. They are arranged in a type of latticework to form units called sarcomeres. There are two types of myofilaments, thin and thick. Thick myofilaments are made of a protein called myosin, whereas thin myofilaments consist of a protein called actin. Thin myofilaments are attached to Z-discs. When a muscle begins to contract, the myosin heads latch onto the actin myofilaments, forming what is known as a cross bridge. The myosin heads propel the actin myofilaments forward toward the center of the sarcomere. Because the actin myofilaments are attached to the Z-discs, they pull the Z-discs closer together, shortening the sarcomere. As the sarcomere shortens, so does the myofibril and the entire muscle. Keep in mind that the myofilaments do not shorten. They stay the same length. The sarcomere shortens because the filaments slide over the top of one another.
Okay, so as that animation just said, the sarcoplasm is filled with myofibrils, which contains sarcomeres. And that's what these lines are that you're actually seeing right here. So we've got Z-disc to Z-disc there. It's actually between the red lines right there, from that red line to that red line. So we're going to look at a close-up view of that here in just a second. But those things are the contractile units of the muscle fiber, meaning those are the things that actually contract. Okay, so the sarcomeres are bundled into groups called myofilaments. Myo, as you remember, means muscle, and filament, I think you know what that means, some sort of a small thread-like thing. And these are actually made of a protein, two proteins. One's called actin and one is called myosin. So here's a picture of a sarcomere. And the first thing that I like to point out here is what's called the Z line or the Z disc. And that is this zigzag line right here on the end. So that's the protein backbone that anchors these actin filaments to the sarcomere. And this is what forms the end boundary. So from one Z disc to another is a boundary. And one thing that you need to understand is that here's one sarcomere here, but right on the other side is another sarcomere, okay? So here's an actin filament that's cut off, but it continues on. And you can see Z disc, and it continues on to the next sarcomere. Okay, so let's start talking about actin first. Okay, see, these are also known as thin filaments for obvious reasons, and they interact with the myosin, which is the purplish colored ones there. Myosin are called thick filaments because they're obviously the thicker ones. Now, this picture isn't in your book, so I added these red lines here to show you what titin is, and titin is T-I-T-I-N, not T-I-T-A-N like the Greek gods, I guess. But it's the protein that anchors the myosin to the Z disc or Z line. Okay, so actin forms what is called a cross bridge, and that's an official term, with the myosin. And what happens is when they interact, they shorten with each other. Now, covering the actin are two proteins called troponin and tropomyosin. So they're inhibitory proteins, and what they do is they prevent the interaction between the actin and the myosin so that we don't form the cross bridges when the muscle is relaxed. And so when we send the impulse to contract a muscle, what it does is it removes those inhibitory proteins. So you can actually have the muscle contraction. Okay, so let's move on to the neuromuscular junction then. So the neuromuscular junction is where the neuron joins the muscle. That's what neuromuscular junction means, okay? So every single muscle fiber has a motor nerve ending. Now that doesn't mean one neuron goes to every single muscle fiber, because one neuron can go to more than one muscle fiber, but it does mean that every single muscle fiber has a neuron ending that goes to it.
A skeletal muscle must be stimulated by a nerve, specifically a motor neuron, to contract. The connection between a motor neuron and a muscle fiber is called a neuromuscular junction. Between the end of the motor nerve and the muscle fiber is a narrow space called the synaptic cleft. When an impulse reaches the end of a motor neuron, it causes small vesicles to release a chemical messenger or neurotransmitter called acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine quickly diffuses across the synaptic cleft, where it stimulates receptors in the sarcolemma, the membrane surrounding the muscle fiber. In turn, this sends an electrical impulse over the sarcolemma and inward along the T-tubules. The impulse in the T-tubules causes the sacs in the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. The calcium binds with the troponin on the actin filament to expose attachment points. In response, the myosin heads of the thick filaments grab onto the thin filaments and muscle contraction occurs. When nerve impulses stop arriving at the neuromuscular junction, acetylcholine is no longer released. Calcium ions are pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. With the calcium removed, troponin and tropomyosin again prevent the myosin heads from grasping the thin filament, and the muscle fiber relaxes.
Okay, so let's move on to the axon terminal. So there's a couple of names for this thing, and this is this yellow thing right here. You can see the electrical sort of signal here, or symbol, trying to show that this is an electrical impulse, because this is the actual neuron. But the problem is, just like when we go from neuron to neuron, when we go from neuron to muscle, there's a gap, and that electricity doesn't have the ability to jump across this gap. So when we need to send the signal from the neuron to the muscle, we have to convert that symbol into a chemical symbol. Signal, rather, not symbol. And so we do that with these things called neurotransmitters. But this axon terminal is the end of the motor neuron. So the neurotransmitter that it has in your muscles is something called acetylcholine, or ACH for short, big A, big C, little h. And that's what these little vesicles are here. They contain that acetylcholine. So the synapse, as I said, is this gap. The terminology is not crystal clear on this. The actual gap is called the synaptic cleft, but you can also call it the synapse. But you can also call this whole sort of structure the synapse. So don't get too hung up on that. It doesn't really matter that much. But anyway, it's the junction between the axon terminal and the muscle fiber sarcolemma, bearing in mind that we also call the synapse between a neuron and another neuron the same thing, or between a gland and a neuron, or whatever the case may be. So acetylcholine is what is released across the synapse, and you might remember from earlier chapters that process is called exocytosis, meaning that it's released from the cell. So let's get a little more specific about the sarcolemma, which remember is the cell membrane, right? The cytoplasm, or plasma membrane rather. Okay, so the acetylcholine attaches to receptors in the sarcolemma. So you can see that it jumps across this gap here and then attaches to receptors on this side. What happens then is it causes calcium channels to open up in the sarcolemma, and that's what sends this electrical signal throughout the muscle fiber. So not only does it run along the muscle fiber, as you can see, these T-tubules, which we'll get to in a minute, it also sends the signals down inside of the muscle fiber, because we've got to get this signal to all of the sarcomeres inside this fiber. And so we have to have these passageways to get it to the inside of the cell. So once we have depolarized the sarcolemma, we've done our muscle contraction, and that was the whole point of doing this, right? Well, so we need to keep that from contracting, because if it continued, then you would have a spasm, right? Or tetany, they call it. And so what we have to do is deactivate it, and the enzyme that deactivates it is called cholinesterase. You see that ace on the end? It's pretty much always talking about some sort of an enzyme. So the T tubules, as I said, were those tubules that bring it the signal to the inside of the cell. So we also have this thing that's semi-unique to a muscle fiber. It's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now you know what the endoplasmic reticulum is. Well, this is the endoplasmic reticulum of the cell. Now it doesn't serve the same purpose in a muscle cell as it does in sort of our normal cells, I guess, if there was such a thing, but it's certainly not the generic cell that we talked about. What it does is it stores calcium ions. So when we need to release those calcium ions to inhibit the troponin and the tropomyosin, to remove them from the actin filaments, we use those by storing them in here. Okay, so let's talk about the actual contraction for a while. So when we need to contract a muscle, remember what, like I said, the calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it binds those two inhibitory proteins, which exposes the actin. That allows the actin to bind with the myosin, and remember we called that the cross bridge, right? So they pull against each other, and the way you can sort of think of this is it's like a tug of war, sort of. So the myosin are like the people, and the actin is like the rope. And so what they do is they pull along that rope, only difference being these things don't have legs, and so instead of being able to just walk backwards, what you have to do is sort of hand over hand and pull them. And so those myosin heads actually pull against the actin and pull it. And what this is called is the sliding filament mechanism. Now, one important thing to understand is how your muscle strength works, because we don't, when it comes to the contraction of a sarcomere, it's an all or nothing principle, they call it. And what that means is it's either contracted or it's not. There's no in between. And so and obviously we don't have, the same amount of muscle contraction when we're lifting, heavy things versus lifting light things. But the way that your brain does that, the way your body does that is by recruiting a different number of muscle fibers. So if you need to lift something very heavy, we recruit a higher number of muscle fibers. If you're lifting something light, like a piece of paper or just nothing at all, just lifting your arm, for example, your brain doesn't recruit as many of those muscle fibers. All right, so let's talk about some sort of gross anatomy and function for just a second. So we've got to define parts of a muscle so we can understand and be able to communicate using words. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is what's called the origin. And this is where the muscle originates. Now, it's not always clear where this is, but most of the time it's pretty simple. So it's usually the more stationary of the two ends. And so if we're looking at the biceps brachii here, which we usually just call the biceps, you can see that the origin is up here toward the shoulder. Now, just so happens that this has two origins, but we'll not get hung up on that at this particular moment. But the origin would be up here toward the shoulder. Because when you contract this, what moves when you contract your biceps? Well, your lower part of your arm, what we call the forearm, is what moves. So this end over here is not the origin. This end would be the origin. Now, this big part, or thick part of the muscle, is what we call the belly of the muscle. But then that brings us over here to this end, which, as you can see labeled there, is called the insertion. So the insertion is the opposite end of the origin. It's going to cross at least one joint, usually. There are exceptions, such as facial muscles and things like that, like around, the orbicularis oris, which is around your eye, and things like that. But mostly it is going to cross at least one joint. Now you can see this actually crosses two joints. It doesn't show it very well, but it does. Both heads cross two joints. But anyway, it's the insertion. Now, one thing to be careful of, you've got to make sure you use the word insert correctly. Okay, now just in our common English vernacular, the muscle inserts on this end and it inserts on this end. But in anatomy, you can't say that because where it inserts is only at the insertion. And so if you say it inserts up here, that's actually incorrect, okay, because it doesn't insert up here. The word we would use is it originates up here. So be careful about that. Okay, so when you're thinking about what we call the action of a muscle, which is the movement, the function of the muscle, all you have to know is that a muscle can only shorten. Okay, and so when a muscle shortens, it brings point A to point B, okay? So it's bringing the insertion closer toward the origin. And so you can imagine what that does. Well, here's our hinge joint right here. And so when we bring the insertion closer to the origin, it's going to pull the forearm up, or what we say, bend the elbow. Okay, and that is what is called the action. And so you can generally figure out what the action is just by understanding that when it shortens, it brings the origin closer to the insertion. Okay, so there are these things called heads of a muscle. Not all of them have them. Some muscles have more than one belly. And so where they originate is called the head of the muscle, or even the belly is called the head of the muscle sometimes. Examples are biceps brachii and triceps brachii. So this word here, biceps, bi means to, sep means head, brachii means arm, which is this part, the upper arm. So this means it's on the arm and it has two heads. Well, the triceps is the same thing, but it's on the back here and it has three heads. Okay, so we have these relationships that we have to define to understand how these muscles interact with each other. Okay, so the action, as I said already, is the function, and that is just the movement that the muscle causes when it contracts. Okay, so we have these things called prime movers, also known as the protagonist, and this is the primary muscle that brings about the desired movement. So using the biceps as our example here, let me say that all over again. Using elbow flexion or bending the elbow as our example here, that means that the biceps brachii is the prime mover or the protagonist. Okay, now if we have a muscle that does one thing, since a muscle can only push, can only pull and doesn't push, if we need to do the opposite action, then we need another muscle to pull it the opposite direction, because we can pull the forearm up with the biceps, but we can't push it back down with the biceps. So we need another muscle to do that. And so, of course, that's going to be the triceps, which is on the other side here and attaches to the olecranon process at the origin or insertion here. And that muscle is called the antagonist. So the antagonist, something that antagonizes something, does the opposite of what something wants. Like my kids antagonize each other constantly, right? And so this muscle does the opposite of the prime mover. Now there's this concept of synergy. Now, if you've ever been in a corporate environment, that they like to talk about this stupid buzzword called synergy, right? And it's like kind of what your team has. But synergy is basically when things work together, okay? And so we do have other muscles that will help bring about the desired movements, right? So if the biceps, if our desired movement is elbow flexion, our prime mover is the biceps brachii. But there are other muscles that help, like the brachialis and the brachioradialis, which we'll get to a little bit later. And those would be called synergists to the elbow flexion. Now, and so they assist the prime mover. Now here's something that's very important to understand. These terms that I've been using are relative, meaning they're related to whatever motion we're talking about. So the prime mover for elbow flexion is the biceps. But what if I asked you what the prime mover for elbow extension was? Okay, straightening the elbow. Well, now we change from the biceps being the prime mover and the triceps being the antagonist to now the triceps is now the prime mover and the biceps is now the antagonist, because it's relative to whatever motion we're talking about. And as I said, I switched the motion to straightening the elbow out. Okay, so a muscle can be a prime mover for one action, but it can be the antagonist for the opposite action. So the biceps is not always the prime mover and the triceps is not always the antagonist. So let's talk about thermogenesis for a while. So look at that word, therm. means heat. Genesis means to generate. So this is the generation of heat from the normal metabolism of the muscle. It's due to two things. Now, the main thing, by far, is the chemical reactions that occur. So you remember in Chapter 2, we talked about decomposition reactions. And so when we decompose a molecule, that means we break bonds. And when we break bonds, it releases energy. Now, we use a lot of that energy to create ATP so that we can contract the muscle, but a lot of that energy gets released in the form of heat because we can't capture all of it. And that's only part of it. The other part of it is when we use the ATP, remember we break that ATP down into ADP and a phosphate group. And when we do that, it also releases heat. Okay, so we're increasing heat when we increase muscle contraction. That's why when you exercise, you get very, very hot. The other reason, though, is friction. Okay, now when molecules rub across each other, it creates heat. And that just happens from the atomic reaction. So you can illustrate that by rubbing your hands together like Mr. Miyagi does on the Karate Kid. You know, the old Karate Kid when I was a kid from like 86 or whatever, if you've ever seen it. Anyway, it creates heat. That's why when you're cold, you can rub your hands together and warm them up. So as I said, it's increased with increased activity. So let's talk about some muscle nomenclature, and this nomenclature is just a big fancy word for naming, okay? So there's different names we use, and we're not going to talk about all of them, but we'll give you some of the kind of major ones, and you know we'll run across more of these as we talk about specific muscle names, but let's at least show you how some of these come about. Okay, so when we're talking about the size of a muscle, you're going to see words like maximus, which means the largest. So if there's a group of muscles, like we're going to talk about the gluteal group, the gluteus maximus is the largest of that group of muscles. Minimus would then be the smallest. We'll also see things like major, which means large, and minor, which means small. Now, some of these are kind of arbitrary. You know, you could pick one or the other, and I don't know, why the anatomists necessarily picked one or the other, but, it doesn't really matter. Anatomy is kind of a pain in the rear sometimes, or I guess we should say a pain in the gluteus, since we know that word now. But anyway, longus means long. Brevis means short, and these are Latin or Greek or whatever. I don't really know, and it doesn't really matter. But you'll see things like the adductor longus and the adductor brevis and things like that. We also name muscles sometimes based on shape. So again, it's arbitrary why anatomists named these muscles, but sometimes you can see why. For example, deltoid, which means triangular shape. So you know what a delta is, the Greek letter delta, or the delta of a river. They're all triangle shapes. Okay, so the deltoid happens to be a muscle over your shoulder, and when you fillet that thing out and lay it out on a table, it's the shape of triangle. Rhomboid is diamond shaped or rhomboid shaped, and we have two muscles that go from the spine to the medial border of the scapulae, and those are the rhomboid major and minor, really rhomboideus major and minor, but no one ever says that. Serratus means sawtooth, so we'll talk about the serratus anterior and the serratus posterior, and they're sawtooth, meaning they're serrated, okay? Trapezius is trapezoid, so the trapezius is a kite-shaped muscle on your back that we'll show you a little bit later. We also name them based on location, such as the pectoralis, which pect means chest, like the pectoral fin of a fish, or the fins on the sort of chest area behind the gills. Brachio means upper arm, because brachia means upper arm, and so when you see something brachio something like brachioradialis, it has something to do with the upper arm, right? Radialis means that it has something to do with the radius, which is a bone. So brachioradialis, for example, originates on the upper arm or the humerus and inserts on the radius. And that was one of the synergists to elbow flexion to the biceps. Gluteus means buttocks, like your rear end. Femoris means femur. Sterno means sternum. These are easy. Oh, by the way, the femur is the upper bone in your lower extremity, which is your thigh bone, right? Cleido means clavicle. Mastoid is your talking about your mastoid process, which you should know because you've had the skeletal system. That is on the temporal bone right behind your ear, that bump back there. Digiti refers to the digits, which are your fingers or toes. Pollicus refers to the thumb, so anything, pollicus means it attaches to your thumb, like flexor pollicus or adductor pollicus or something like that. Hallucus refers to your big toe, same thing there. Lateralis means that it's more lateral. Medialis means that it's more medial. And intermedius means that it's in the middle. Okay, so we'll talk about the quadriceps group, and we'll talk about every single one of those terms. Profundus means deep. Superficialis means superficial. We're not going to actually talk about any of those, but when you're talking about the extrinsic hand muscles and wrist muscles, there are profundus and superficialis groups. In a higher anatomy class, you'll learn those. That this anatomy class is not for that. Okay, another way we name them is based on the number of origins. Biceps, as I said, has 2 heads. Triceps has 3 heads. Quadriceps has 4 heads. Now, technically, quadriceps is actually 4 different muscles, where the biceps and triceps are not. That's one muscle with 3 heads and one muscle with 2 heads. Quadriceps is 4 muscles, but whatever. We might name them based on the direction or sort of the orientation. So rectus means straight. So we'll talk about rectus abdominis and the rectus femoris. Those run straight up and down along the axis of your torso or along the axis of your lower extremity. If they are transverse, like transversus abdominis, they run sideways or across. So they run not parallel to your axis of your body, but the opposite or perpendicular. Oblique means diagonal, so we'll talk about some of the abdominal muscles. We also might name them based on their action, such as adductor, adducts. When you adduct, that means you bring something, as you remember, towards your body. So if you bring your upper extremity towards your body, that is, as people have said, adding it to your body, which is not what that means, but it's a good way to remember it. Abductor, as you remember, abducts it or takes it away. When you get abducted, you get taken away, whether it's by aliens or some evil human kidnapping you, right? So when you take your upper extremity, for example, away from your body, that's abducting it. It may be called a flexor, like a flexor digitorum, means that they would flex your fingers, right? It might be extensor digitorum or extensor carpi or whatever, which means it extends your wrist, right? Levator means it elevates, like the levator scapulae, elevate your shoulder blade so you can, what helps shrug your shoulders along with your trapezius. Okay, so let's talk about individual muscles. So here's what I want you to know for the test, for the following muscles we're going to talk about. You should be able to identify them on a picture, and not necessarily the picture in the book, but any picture. Okay, you're not always going to have the picture out of your book when you're in your job. And you should know the basic action, right? I don't need you to know the exact action, but you need to be able to have common sense enough to know, well, this is where the muscle originates and this is where it inserts. And so if you bring point A closer to point B, it's probably going to cause this joint to do this, which means you're going to fill in the blank. Flex the elbow, bend the knee, extend the hip, dorsiflex the foot, whatever. Okay? So nothing specific. Just use common sense, as I said. And just remember, muscles shorten and brings the two ends together. And remember, circular muscles make the circle smaller. So we're going to run into 2 circular muscles that we'll talk about today. You should know the approximate origin and insertion, and you should know if they belong to any of these following groups. Okay, now there are more groups than this, just that some of them are a little more difficult and we're not going to talk about them, okay? And that's for these bolded ones below. I'm going to have these groups bolded below. But they're the quadriceps group, which we just call quads, calf group, hamstrings or hams, and the glutes. Okay? Like I said, there's more like the rotator cuff, but we're not going to talk about all of them. Just some of the majors. Okay? So here's the muscles I want you to know on the head and neck. The frontalis. This muscle, as you can see, when it shortens, it's going to lift your eyebrows. So if you want to act surprised, you use your frontalis muscle, and it happens to be attached to the frontal bone, really the fascia on the frontal bone. But the orbicularis oculi, these, as you can see from the word they are around the orbit, which is your eye socket. Oculi means eye, right? And so these are the muscles that, as you know, it's a circular muscle, so it's going to make the circle smaller. So this is how you squint. So if you squint your eyes, in the sun or whatever, you're using your orbicularis oculi. The masseter muscle, as you can see over here, is on the side of your jaw. It originates on the zygomatic arch, or the zygomatic bone, and inserts on the angle of the mandible down here. Okay, so you can imagine when you shorten this, it's going to pull the mandible up. Well, you can call that elevating your mandible, or you can call it biting, clenching your teeth, whatever. If you put your hands on the side of your cheeks right now and bite down, you're going to feel that muscle poke out. The temporalis, now this is actually not drawn correctly. It doesn't go behind your ear. It actually goes in front of your ear through the zygomatic arch. So there's actually a bone over the top of it, and it attaches to a process on your mandible here, not the condyle, but the conoid process, or coronoid process. Gosh, I need to think about that. Anyway, and it does the same thing as the masseter. So if you put your hands on the side of your head and clench your teeth, you're going to feel that muscle bulging out. That's the temporalis. And the reason why it's called the temporalis is because it originates on the temporal bone. The sternocleidomastoids, big long word. We usually don't call it that. We just call it the SCM because it takes too long. But break that word down and look at it. Sterno means it originates on the sternum, and cleido, clavicle. So this is where it originates. And it inserts on the mastoid process, which is the bump behind your ear. So here's the SCM right here. And so the action of it's kind of difficult because it has a different action when it's contracting unilaterally compared to when it contracts bilaterally. So I'm just going to tell you right now, I won't put that on the test. Orbicularis oris. This muscle goes around your mouth, and this muscle, as you can see, is a circular muscle. Orbit means it orbits, just like we said right here. Oris means mouth, oral cavity is your mouth, right? When it contracts, this is how you pucker your lips. This is your kissing muscle. All right, let's talk about the abdominal wall. The rectus abdominis. This is your six-pack muscle. This is this muscle here. You have a left side and a right side here. This side's just covered with fascia. They just took it off right here. But the rectus abdominis, abdomen, is where we get abdominis from, and rectus means straight. So it goes straight up and down here on your abdomen. It is sectioned. There's these little sections here, and that's why you get that six-pack appearance here. So there's multiple bellies on this muscle. And so it's honestly a little bit difficult to say where it originates, but I can tell you it originates up here on your ribs. So when you contract this muscle, it pulls the pelvis up. Well, it depends. I mean, you can pull the pelvis up, or you can do a sit-up and pull the ribs up. I don't know. It doesn't really matter, but it definitely flexes the trunk. Okay, you can imagine. So it crosses multiple joints called your spinal joints and causes your trunk to flex. This is how you do a sit-up. The external oblique. External tells us that it's external. Oblique tells us the direction these muscle fibers run. And they run sort of diagonal down like this. The internal oblique is internal to the external, and they run this direction. You can see the external is removed here, and here's the internal. And they run this direction here, this direction here. And then internal to that, we have the transversus abdominis muscle, which is this muscle, and they run transverse, so perpendicular to the spine. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is not a muscle, but it's this line right here that goes in between the rectus abdominis, and that's called the linea alba, which means white line in Latin. Okay, muscles of the shoulder and the back. The deltoid, this muscle that caps your shoulder. Now, I told you earlier that it's triangle-shaped, so it doesn't look like it there, but when you cut it off and lay it on a table, it is. Originates up here on the clavicle and the shoulder blade and inserts on the humerus. And so when you shorten that muscle, it's going to bring the arm up and out, so you can flap like a bird. So it abducts the shoulder, you could say, or you could say it abducts the arm. Or you could even say it abducts the upper extremity, but people don't say that. Pectoralis major, that's this big muscle here. This is the big chest muscle. Now we have a major and a minor. There's no picture of the minor, but it's underneath the major. What they do is they originate up here on the ribs and the sternum and insert on the humerus. And so when it contracts, it brings your, it's hard to show on the computer here, but it brings your arms together. If you kept your elbows locked and clapped in front of you, that's basically what this muscle does. So if you're doing an exercise to isolate this muscle, you're going to do what's called a fly. Serratus anterior is this serrated muscle right here. Also attaches to the humerus and brings the arm sort of down and forward. Latissimus dorsi, there's a better picture. There's just the edge of it right there. In just a sec, I'll show you a better one from the back. It attaches from the back also up to the humerus and also brings the arm down. So when you're doing a lat pull, that's what we call this, lat for short. When you're doing a lat pull, you're using that muscle to pull the humerus down. So there's a better picture of it right there. The trapezius muscle. We only show one side here. This side's taken off. But here is the trapezius. It starts clear down here at the upper lumbar region or lower thoracic region. It goes all the way. It doesn't show it go all the way, but it goes all the way to the bump on the back of your head called the external occipital protuberance. Okay, so depending on which part of this muscle you contract, and your brain can isolate only parts of this muscle. So we kind of generally talk about the upper trap and the lower trap. Now, when it contracts the lower trap, it brings the shoulder blade down and toward the spine, which is medial. When it contracts the upper trap, it brings your shoulder blades up and medially. So this is how you shrug your shoulders along with the levator scapula, which is right here. When you contract the whole thing, it's what we call it retraction of the scapulae. So it just brings the shoulder blades closer together. Okay, moving on to the upper extremity, the triceps brachii, 3 heads, originates on the olecranon process of the ulna and inserts up here, 2 heads on the humerus, 1 head up on the shoulder blade, but just up in this area is good enough. And so when you shorten it, it pulls the olecranon up, which straightens the elbow out. Brachialis, right here on the side, goes from the brachium down here to the radius. It's really some fascia here, but to the radius here. Brachialis originates on the brachium, or the humerus, I should say, and inserts down here on the radius. I think I said that wrong. Humerus to radius. I'm not sure what I said there. But elbow flexion. So both of those, along with the biceps, are elbow flexion. Biceps brachii, elbow flexion. Originates on the scapula in 2 different spots. One is above the glenoid cavity, and the other one is on the coracoid process. And then inserts down here on some connective tissue that attaches to both the ulna and the radius. So elbow flexion. Hand and digit flexors. Here's what I want you to know about this. There's a bunch of them. Very hard to identify, not really what this class is for. But I want you to know that they are located on the anterior and medial part here. So on the pinky side, right? So we'd say the ulnar side. Now this is what makes up your, well, they attach to what's called the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Okay, so when these muscles get inflamed at their origin, it's called medial epicondylitis, which is tennis elbow. You may have heard of that. The flexors are over on the opposite side, back here on the lateral side. So they attach to the lateral epicondyle, and so this is what you get. I said that backwards. This is tennis elbow. Medial epicondylitis is golfer's elbow. Okay, so when you extend, like doing a backhand in tennis, you can get irritation of this, and that's what is called tennis elbow. The lower extremity, the sartorius, is this big long muscle here. They call this the tailor's muscle, Tailor. A tailor is somebody who sews, because apparently when you sit cross-legged, that's what a tailor does, to sew clothes. I don't know. Anyhow, this here is the tailor's muscle. Okay, so where that muscle goes, it originates on the ASIS, anterior superior iliac spine of the ilium right here, and it inserts on the medial part of the tibia right below the knee. That's something called the pes anserine. Oh, there we go. As I said, the Taylor's muscle. Okay, the adductor group. This is our groin. Okay, I'm not going to make you learn any of the muscles of it, but here they are: adductor magnus, adductor brevis, adductor longus, gracilis. They're just too hard to identify because it's too confusing. But what they do is they originate on the pelvis, and they insert down here on the medial epicondyle of the femur. And so when they shorten, they bring the femur, they adduct the femur. That's why these are all called, or the hip. That's why these are all called adductors. But this is the groin. I've talked to you guys before about this. The groin is not this area, or it's not your crotch where you get kicked. Okay, I know that's what we say all the time, but that is not what your groin is. Your groin is this group of muscles. So when you get a groin pull, it is an actual muscle tear of one of these muscles right here. So I just want you to know where the adductor group is, but I don't need you to know any of the specific muscles for this particular class. Okay, the quadriceps femoris, or the quads. Here's a group you need to know. It consists of obviously 4 muscles: the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, the vastus intermedius, and the vastus medialis. So here they all are. Here's the vastus lateralis. Here's the vastus medialis, and these are very easily seen on a muscular person or just a skinny person. And then right in between them is the rectus femoris. Now, if you take this rectus femoris out of the way, you will see the vastus intermedius. And as you remember, intermediate means between, right? So it's between the vastus lateralis and the vastus medialis. Okay, so what do all these muscles do? Well, they all attach right here to the patella. And so you can imagine, and then the patella continues on and attaches to the tibial tuberosity. Okay, so they cross the knee joint and attach to the tibial tuberosity. So if you just pretend the patella is not there, because it kind of doesn't have anything to do with anything, all it's there for is to act as a pulley so you don't rub through the quad tendons. Anyway, it originates up here on the same place that the sartorius originates, on the ASIS. And so when you shorten, so it crosses 2 joints, but it doesn't act on the hip joint much. Its primary action is on the knee joint. It's going to pull the tibia up, which means it's going to straighten the knee or extend the knee. Glutes, a group you need to know, consists of 3 muscles: the gluteus maximus, which is this big muscle here, the gluteus medius, which is right here, and the gluteus maximus originates on the medial border of the sacrum, and inserts out here on the greater trochanter. And so it's actually a hip extender primarily, and a little bit of a hip abductor, abductor. Okay. Now the gluteus medius originates up here on the iliac crest and on the greater trochanter, and is your primary hip abductor, abductor. So it brings the hip away. The gluteus minimus, this is not exactly where, I mean, when you look at different anatomy books, they're all going to be drawn differently. Okay, so I don't know if this is exactly where the minimus is. This is certainly not where I learned where the minimus is. I learned that the minimus comes along off of the border of the sacrum and onto the greater trochanter, and I learned it as an external rotator of the hip. Now, this obviously would not externally rotate the hip. This would adduct and almost flex the hip. So I don't know. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to ask you this. Unfortunately, in anatomy, there's not always agreement on everything. It's a little bit frustrating. But I do want you to know that these are all part of the glutes. Hamstrings, also 3 muscles, consist of the biceps femoris, and this is the lateral of the hamstring. So if you are sitting in a chair with your legs at 90 degrees, if you reach right behind your knee to the lateral part of it, you can feel the tendon sticking out there. The semitendinosus and the semimembranosus are the 2 medial ones over here. Now, they all originate on what's called the ischial tuberosity, which you might recall we call your butt bone, which because that's where you sit. Some people call them your sits bones because it's where you're sitting right now if you're sitting down. And they insert on the lower leg on the tibia and the fibula. So when you contract those, it's going to bring your lower leg up, which means it's flexing your knee, bending your knee. Okay, so the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, you can feel the tendons on the medial part behind your knee. You may need to push down toward the floor with your foot, and they'll pop out. Okay, the calf, also 3 muscles, the gastrocnemius, the soleus, and the plantaris. Now, the gastrocnemius is this big muscle that you see. You can a lot of times see this border on really muscular people. Now, right behind it is the soleus. So you have to actually take, and you can see the soleus, just not very well. You can see it if you pull the gastrocnemius away. The reason why they call the soleus is because when you look at it, it looks like the fillet of a fish, and there's a type of fish called a sole. It's like a flounder or something. Or maybe a flounder is a sole fish. I don't know exactly, but anyway, it looks like some sort of fish. Now the plantaris, very small. This I think is not the plantaris. It's the I want to say anconius, but that's wrong because that's at the elbow. Can't think of it right now. But anyway, it's a small muscle right here. Gemellus, that's what this one is actually. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's behind here, tiny little muscle, really long tendon. All 3 of these muscles become the Achilles tendon. All 3 of them. About 25% of humans do not have a plantaris. And then the last thing we are going to talk about are the foot extensors. And I'm only going to make you even learn one of these, okay? There's groups. The flexors of the foot, which we call plantar flexors. And really this should probably be called the dorsiflexors of the foot. They're in groups. But anyway, the main one is this tibialis anterior. Okay, it's right next to your tibia, which we call your shin. It's just lateral to it. So when you lift your foot up, you feel that thing pop out. It gets pretty sore and hypertrophied if you're a runner, because this dorsiflexes your foot or lifts your foot up. So every time you run, you work that muscle. And as I said, the dorsiflexors of the calf or of the foot are the calf. And that's all I need you to know as far as those groups go. And that is the end.